The marathon has been a staple event in the Olympics since the very first modern Olympic Games, which took place in 1896 in Athens, Greece. The marathon is both a celebration of physical resilience and an homage to the ancient Greek origins of the Olympic Games. The event remains extremely popular, and many hundreds of marathon races have been established in countries all around the globe, allowing dedicated runners to put their endurance and physical fitness to the test. The marathon itself draws its name from the Battle of Marathon, which took place in 490 BCE and marked the turning point in the first Persian invasion of Greece, when the heavily outnumbered Athenian army defeated the Persian army upon the plain of Marathon. According to the legend, immediately after the Athenian victory at Marathon, a messenger named Phidippides, or alternatively Philippides, ran to the city of Athens to inform the rulers of the city-state of their great victory, and to warn them that the remnants of the Persian army, who had embarked upon their ships docked in the Bay of Marathon, were sailing for Athens. Prior to the battle, Phidippides had been dispatched from Athens to Sparta to request the aid of the Spartans. Unfortunately, however, the Spartans were celebrating a festival and could not leave until a full moon, so Phidippides had to return back to Athens with the bad news. As an aside, Greek historian Herodotus of Halicarnassus writes that Phidippides ran from Athens to Sparta in a day and a half, a distance of about 153 miles, which is way more impressive than his later feat, and gives its name to a lesser-known event, the Spartathlon, a 153-mile ultramarathon ran annually in Greece since 1983. Though, technically, Phidippides ran two Spartathlons back-to-back, which, if true, is a truly remarkable feat of human endurance. Anyways, when Phidippides arrived at Athens after the victory at Marathon, having ran a distance of about 26 miles, he delivered his message to the city's chief magistrates before dying of exhaustion from the ordeal. The Athenian army was also able to reach the city before the Persians and warded them off, ending the first Persian invasion of Greece. Herodotus does not mention this final journey of Phidippides, but the Greek writer Plutarch, writing some 500 years after the battle, mentions a man named Eucles who ran in full armour, hot from the battle, and bursting in at the doors of the first men of the state, could only say, "Hail, we are victorious," and straightway expired. The Syrian-Greek historian Lucian gave a similar account over a century after Plutarch, though he identified the messenger as Phidippides, an account which has taken primacy in popular retellings, most notably Robert Browning's 1879 poem Phidippides. Whether this messenger was or was not actually Phidippides is ultimately irrelevant. French philologist and one of the founders of the modern Olympic Games, Michel Breal, chose to honour this legendary feat by proposing the introduction of a 26-mile race to the Games, dubbed the Marathon. But the particular marathon we're looking at today is a far cry from the noble journey of Phidippides. Instead, we're going to examine perhaps the most disastrous sporting event ever held in the history of the Olympics, the 1904 St. Louis Marathon. The 1904 Summer Olympic Games did not start particularly well. Chicago, Illinois was the city that actually won the bid to host the Games, but this was protested by the organisers of the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition, held in St. Louis, Missouri. This exposition commemorated the 100-year anniversary of the Louisiana Purchase, when the United States purchased the territory of Louisiana from France at the price of $15 million, which even back then was a comically good deal for over 828,000 square miles of land, effectively doubling the size of the continental United States. Touted as a world fair, the Louisiana Purchase exhibition was to be an enormous event, drawing crowds from across the world to St. Louis, and, in a neat coincidence, costing $15 million, a little over $500 million in today's currency. Around 50 nations staged exhibits to an audience of over 19 million, spread across a 1,200-acre park containing approximately 1,500 buildings. This was an absolutely monumental project, so much so that the event was delayed a year. The Louisiana Purchase actually took place in 1803. Perhaps understandably, the exposition's organisers were not happy to discover that the Olympic Games were to be hosted elsewhere in the United States, potentially drawing away attendees and international attention. In response, the exposition's organisers, led by their president, David R. Francis, threatened to host their own separate, much grander and widely publicised sporting games, unless the Olympics were moved to St. Louis. Pressure also came from James Edward Sullivan, who held the role of Olympic Games director as well as chief of physical culture at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. Upon learning of this threat, Pierre de Coubertin, the principal founder of the modern Olympic Games, stepped in and awarded the 1904 Summer Olympic Games to the city of St. Louis, set to run between July 1st and November 23rd of that year. Even with this problem sorted, other events conspired to sabotage the Games. War had broken out between the Russian Empire and the Empire of Japan, a conflict which would last from February 1904 to September 1905, ending in Japanese victory after the famous Russian naval defeat at the Battle of Tsushima. As a side note, the story of the Russian Baltic Fleet's journey to the Sea of Japan is absolutely ridiculous and definitely the subject of a later video. This war ensured that both Japan and Russia were tied up, and resulting tensions across Europe severely reduced the number of athletes able to attend. In fact, only 62 of the 648 athletes competing in the Games came from outside North America. It also did not help that St. Louis is located quite far inland in the United States, and given that mass transport was nowhere near as developed as it is today, it was therefore quite hard to get to. But despite only 12 nations being represented, as opposed to the previous Games' 26, the 1904 Summer Games went on. The sporting events were hosted at 5 separate venues, with the majority taking place at Francis Olympic Field, which hosted archery, athletics, cycling, football, that's soccer to you Americans, gymnastics, lacrosse, roque, which is basically American croquet, tennis, tug of war, which was a popular Olympic event until 1920, weightlifting, and wrestling. There were also anthropology days, hosted by the organisers of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. Grotesquely, these included human zoos, which were unfortunately common at world fairs. The St. Louis Zoo featured around 1,400 indigenous people from around the world, displayed in exhibits designed to mimic their natural habitat. America was comparatively new to the imperial stage, and so about 1,100 Filipinos were displayed as part of these exhibits, showcasing the indigenous populace of the US's newly acquired colony, the Philippines, ceded by Spain after the Spanish-American War of 1898. The exhibited people were encouraged to participate in primitive games, including foot races, tug of war, and rock and javelin throwing. Also on display were indigenous students from American boarding schools, showcasing the efforts of the so-called civilizing mission and reinforcing American colonial rhetoric. But let's move on to the main event, at least for this video, the marathon. The 1904 Olympic Marathon took place on August 30th, involving 32 athletes representing 7 nations: the United States, Great Britain, France, Cuba, Canada, Greece, and the Orange River Colony, a British colony established in South Africa after the 1902 annexation of the Orange Free State. America were the favourites to win, with experienced marathon runners like Sam Mellor, A.L. Newton, John Loudon, Michael Spring, and Thomas Hicks competing. Interestingly, this was also the first modern Olympic event in which black Africans competed, these being 2 men hailing from the South African Tswana people, Len Tiernan and Jan Mashiani. The pair were being exhibited at a World Fair Anthropology Day, misidentified as Zulu tribesmen as part of an exhibit on the Second Anglo-Boer War. As veterans, the 2 were employed by the exposition and were allowed to participate in the marathon event by its organisers. The route was 24 miles, 1,500 yards, as the standard marathon length of 26 miles, 385 yards had not yet been established. Several incredibly poor decisions were made by the event organisers prior to the start of the race. Firstly, the event started at 3 p.m, the hottest part of the day. Any avid long-distance runner can tell you that such runs should begin as early in the day as possible to take advantage of cooler temperatures. Secondly, the route was hilly and not even fully paved. Certain stretches were little more than dirt tracks that got incredibly dusty in the dry heat of the day, and were also strewn with rocks and debris. Thirdly, the route wasn't even cleared for the race. Cars, wagons, downtown trolleys, pedestrians, and even trains had to be avoided by runners, adding an additional element of unpredictable danger to the race. Fourthly, and perhaps most dangerous of all, the event organisers failed to provide adequate hydration stations for the athletes, the only source of water being a well 12 miles in, which, according to one report, gave those who drank from it intestinal pain. Well, technically, there was a water tower 6 miles in, but only Cuban athlete Felix Carvajal was able to scale and drink from it. Carvajal himself had a rough time getting to the event. A postman by trade and only 5'1" in height, he had raised money by running across Cuba, but once he arrived by boat in New Orleans, he lost his money playing dice and was forced to hitchhike to St. Louis, arriving just before the race began, having not eaten in over 40 hours, and wearing heavy dress shoes and trousers hastily cut off at the knee. Director James E. Sullivan argued that he deliberately did not construct any water sources for the athletes in order to give them, quote, purposeful dehydration. I don't know about you, but in my opinion, this man was either a genuine sadist or had completely forgotten and came up with that as an excuse. Olympic official Charles J.P. Lucas, author of the official record of the 1904 Olympic Games, wrote the following: "The course through St. Louis County was the most difficult a human being was ever asked to run over. At Athens, the road from the battlefield of Marathon, and that at Paris were boulevards compared to the course selected in St. Louis." So, things were already looking incredibly bad, but the show must go on. Despite his previous grievances with the Olympic Committee, David R. Francis, the president of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, fired the starting pistol at 3:03 p.m., August 30th, surrounded by a crowd 10,000 strong. It was a lovely summer day. A bit too lovely, in fact. The temperature was a dry 32 degrees Celsius when the starting shot rang out. The punishing heat and choking dust almost immediately took their toll, and even experienced marathon runners struggled immensely. John Lorden, the winner of the previous year's Boston Marathon, began vomiting within the first half mile of the race and dropped out after 10 miles of misery. Len Tournier was chased off the course by a wild dog. William R. Garcia, hailing from San Francisco, was found lying by the roadside 8 miles from the finish line, suffering from a near-fatal stomach hemorrhage caused by ingesting airborne dust. Thankfully, he was seen to by a doctor and survived the ordeal. Sam Mellor, who had previously won the 1902 Boston Marathon, developed severe cramps about halfway through the race and dropped out shortly afterwards, overcome by dust. Meanwhile, Felix Carvajal seemed to be enjoying himself. He would routinely stop and chat with onlookers, making use of the scraps of English he had picked up on his journey to St. Louis. In an article published in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch the following day, the writer tells the reader that while following the race in his car, he passed the little Cuban 3 miles out, still running at an even gait, and he waved his cap and yelled enthusiastically. Charles Lucas wrote of Carvajal, "His pace was slow, less than a dog trot, but strong. Wherever a crowd had assembled along the road to see the runners pass, Carvajal would stop to chat in broken English, and must have lost almost 60 minutes in time. On one occasion, he stopped at the author's automobile, where a party were eating peaches, and begged for some. Being refused, he playfully snatched 2 and ran along the road, eating them as he ran." Felix Carvajal's enjoyment wouldn't last, though. Still hungry, Carvajal stopped at an orchard and ate several apples he found lying about. Unfortunately, these turned out to be rotten, and Carvajal began to suffer from stomach cramps. Seemingly not in any great hurry, he lay down and took a nap.
Despite all of this, Carvial finished in 4th place, leading Lucas to comment, "Had Carvial had anyone with him, he was totally unattended, he would not only have won the race, but would have lowered the Olympic record." The athletes weren't the only ones at risk. A car following the race, containing 2 men, Philip B. Fouque and Dr. F. W. Harvey, came off the road and plunged over an embankment. Fouque was thrown from the vehicle, which rolled over and pinned Dr. Harvey beneath it. Both men were immediately assisted and taken to the nearby St. Luke's Hospital, where, thankfully, they both made a full recovery. Another odd occurrence worth mentioning was the unannounced arrival of 10 Greek athletes at the start of the race, all residents in the United States. All bar one had to drop out due to the horrific conditions of the event, but the last remaining of their number, Dimitrios Veloulis, completed the race in 5th place. Charles Lucas, observing the runner's strong pace but comparative lack of speed, reckoned that, had he trained for the event, Veloulis may well have ended up winning. The first person to complete the torturous journey and cross the finish line was Fred Lawes. Lawes was a peculiar character. A bricklayer by trade, he trained as a long-distance runner during the night and qualified for the Olympics by placing in a 5-mile race sponsored by the Amateur Athletic Union. 9 miles into the race, Lawes began suffering from severe cramps, but rather than stop or retire from the race, he hopped into one of the cars accompanying the runners and travelled some 11 miles in relative luxury, while his fellow athletes ran for the top spot, or in some cases, their lives. Having recovered from his cramps with only 4 miles of the race left, Lawes hopped out of the automobile and continued the race on foot, now comfortably in 1st place. Lawes was spotted disembarking from the car by one of Thomas Hicks's handlers, who yelled at him to leave the race. Lawes continued undeterred, though, and crossed the finish line to the cheers of the gathered spectators, with a supposed time of 3 hours, 13 minutes. Fortunately, Lawes' cheating was quickly revealed, and he was confronted by the booing crowd and furious race attendants. Lawes jovially claimed that he had simply been playing a joke by finishing the race and didn't intend to claim victory. Charles Lucas, however, did not find this joke particularly funny, and wrote in the official report, "The perfidy of Lawes will never be forgotten. He has cast a blot upon his own hitherto good record, and the incident was the only one which marred the greatest athletic carnival of modern times." So, who did finish in 1st place? Well, that dubious honour went to Thomas Hicks, who had previously distinguished himself by coming 2nd in the Boston Marathon a few months prior. Hicks was a British-born manual labourer hailing from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and was one of the American favourites to win. Now, Hicks didn't ride in an automobile like Lawes, but he certainly didn't win entirely by his own merit, though finishing the race seems like punishment enough for the poor man. See, Hicks, like many of his fellows in this awful race, began to suffer from dehydration around the 10-mile mark. Hicks begged his handlers, who started running alongside him, for a drink of water. Strangely, they didn't oblige, but instead sponged his mouth with warm water. Nearly delirious from exhaustion, Hicks was severely flagging around the 17-mile mark. Seeing this, his handlers once again intervened and fed him a mixture of egg whites and strychnine in an attempt to revive him.
Now, this is notable for 2 reasons. 1. This is in fact the first recorded instance of performance-enhancing drugs being used at the Olympics. And 2. Strychnine is no normal PED. It's actually a type of rat poison, though it does act as a sort of stimulant in low doses.
With 2 miles of the race left, and hearing that Fred Lawes had been disqualified, Hicks's handlers administered another dose of strychnine and egg whites, this time washed down with some French brandy. So, fueled by eggs, rat poison, and strong booze, the now deathly pale athlete ran the final 2 miles, hallucinating and believing he still had 20 miles to run. Charles Lucas described Hicks running the last 2 miles. Hicks was running mechanically, like a well-oiled piece of machinery. His eyes were dull, lustreless. The ashen colour of his face and skin had deepened. His arms appeared as weights well tied down. He could scarcely lift his legs, while his knees were almost stiff. By the time the poor guy finished, he was essentially carried over the line by his trainers, feebly kicking his legs. finishing with a time of 3 hours, 28 minutes and 53 seconds, and having also finished the entire flask of brandy. The St. Louis Dispatch paints an unpleasant scene. There was not a semblance of the elastic spring with which he had started. He must have heard the uproar about him, but he betrayed no sign of it. He was past that. He did look up once when the din was at its height. He was within a few yards of the finish. His lower jaw was hanging, as in imbecility. His eyes stared blankly, but his pitiful expression didn't change.
Nowadays, this would be grounds for immediate disqualification and possibly attempted murder charges for Hicks's handlers. But back in 1904, there weren't really any regulations regarding PEDs, so Hicks was awarded the win. After 1 hour and the ministrations of no less than 4 doctors, Hicks finally felt well enough to leave the course.
French athlete Albert Corey came in second, seemingly in good condition, and should really be considered the overall winner, considering Hicks's unfair advantage. American Arthur Newton came third. Len Tiernan, after shaking off the pursuing wild dog and rejoining the race, came ninth, and his companion Jan Masciani came 12th. Though Charles Lucas praised Tiernan's running abilities, both he and the author of the following day's St. Louis Globe report on the race refer to the pair repeatedly using a derogatory racial slur rather than their names, another example of the racism which soured the 1904 games. Len Tiernan and Jan Masciani were also wrongly named as Lentau and Yamasini, which was corrected in official records decades later.
Of the 32 athletes who started the race, only 14 managed to finish. A disastrous result for a disastrous event, and Hicks's finishing time remains the slowest winning time in the history of the Olympic marathon by a full 29 minutes. But considering the dangers of traffic, wild dogs, dust, heat, dehydration, obstacles, uneven terrain, and poisoning, both accidental and deliberate, it's a miracle that anyone finished at all, so props to those 14 that did.
Thomas Hicks and Fred Lawes would actually face off again in the 1905 Boston Marathon, though this time Lawes would win fair and square, with Hicks not even placing. Felix Carvial would return to St. Louis in 1905 and compete in the inaugural All-Western Marathon, finishing in third. Strychnine would actually make another, more recent appearance at the Olympics, with Kyrgyz weightlifter Izat Artikov being stripped of his bronze medal at the 2016 Rio de Janeiro Summer Olympic Games after testing positive for the substance.
I'll round this episode off with another funny story involving Felix Carvial, who was quickly becoming one of my favourite athletes of all time. In 1906, Carvial was chosen by the government of Cuba to represent the nation at the Intercalated Games Marathon in Athens. This time he would be fully funded by the government and would depart by boat to Italy, and then on to Greece. When he disembarked in Italy, however, Carvial disappeared and never showed up in Athens, missing the games entirely. Believing him dead, Cuban newspapers published his obituary, only for Carvial to later show up in Havana, disembarking from a Spanish steamer. What exactly he got up to during his disappearance, who knows? But he seemed no worse for wear when the customs official confirmed his identity and watched as the man ran off to go and visit a friend. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm not terribly knowledgeable about the modern Olympics, so I found this one really interesting to research. If you enjoyed it, please do like the video and subscribe if you'd like to see more. I have another episode of Tales from the Cold War coming soon, so stay tuned for that. And I am on Patreon, so if you'd like to support the channel and keep up to date with my projects, please do check that out as well. But, as always, thank you all very much, and I'll see you next time.